Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Miso Soup. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make this amazing soup at home. Since if you're only enjoying this when you go to Japanese restaurants, that is not nearly enough. And I'm not sure if this is the world's most simple complex soup or the world's most complex simple soup. But either way, nothing quite looks or tastes like it. And it could not be easier to make. And that's even if you do it from scratch, which is what we're going to do right now. And to get started, the first thing we have to do is make what's called a dashi. And for that, besides water, we only need 2 ingredients. All right, we need something called bonito flakes, which looks exactly like shaved wood. And that's for a good reason, since it's actually pieces of tuna dried as hard as wood, and then shaved very, very thinly. And then we're also going to need a type of dried seaweed called kombu, which is a type of kelp. And do not, under any circumstances, wipe off that white powdery substance on the surface. Okay, it kind of looks like salt, but it's actually the residue of an alcohol sugar. And it's one of the things that makes our dashi so savory. So please leave that alone. And what we'll do first is take our kombu and we'll add it to 6 cups of cold fresh water in a saucepan. And once we place that in and given it a dunk or two, what we'll do is let that sit for 30 minutes, during which time that kelp's going to start to rehydrate, and it will begin releasing all those amazing and mysterious flavors. And then once 30 minutes has passed, we can head to the stove, where we will place this over medium heat. And then all we have to do for the first step of this dashi process is slowly bring this up just to the point where it starts to simmer, which on medium heat is going to take a little while. And when we start to see steam rising from the top and little tiny bubbles forming around the outside of the pan, we will really begin paying attention, and we will watch it very closely. And as soon as we see bigger bubbles coming up from the bottom of the pan, making their way through the kelp, and it sort of starts bouncing around on the top, and we feel like it's just starting to simmer, we'll go ahead and grab a strainer or some tongs, because that's as far as we want to go. Okay, at that point, we'll turn off the heat, and we'll give that a little bit of a stir, and then we'll quickly but very carefully transfer that into a bowl. And by the way, the reason we don't want to let this keep simmering is because that's going to change the flavor of the kombu, and it's going to get slimy and bitter. And while the texture is not going to matter, we definitely don't want any bitterness. And then once we have that transferred in, we can go ahead and press out any excess liquid back into the pan. And that's it. The first half of our dashi is done. And then what we'll do for part 2 is set our heat to medium-high, and we will wait for this to come up to a simmer, at which point we will stir in our bonito flakes, and then we'll turn off the heat, even though I think I just did that in the opposite order. But officially, we should stir in the bonito flakes and then turn off the heat. And then once the heat's off, we're going to let this steep for 10 minutes before we safely strain this, reserving all the liquid. And 10 minutes is just how long I like to go, but you could do it for less time for a lighter dashi, or more time for a stronger dashi. In fact, some people even simmer it a little bit before they turn off the heat. So the exact time is going to be up to you. I mean, you are, after all, the me of making this soup, which is really more of a tea. So, if you've never made it before, maybe go with the 10 minutes and then adjust from there. But like I just said, 10 minutes gives me the exact strength dashi I want. And that's it. Once the 10 minutes is up, we'll go ahead and strain that, pressing out as much liquid as we can. And that's it. We just made dashi, which, as you may know, is used as a base for like hundreds of different Japanese recipes. Although I'm guessing miso soup is the most popular. And you kind of have to taste this yourself to really understand what's going on. But I would describe it as a very, very savory, sort of meaty taste of the ocean. And no, in case you're wondering, it's not very fishy at all. And I don't really want to, but I'm going to tell you anyway. They make some really good dashi powders that you just mix with water and you're done. Which apparently is what 90% of people in Japan do, or so I hear. But anyway, if you did want to make it from scratch, that's how you do it. And at this point, we can transfer that back into our pan. And we can move on to actually making the miso soup. And for that, here's what we're going to need. And we'll start with the most important, and that would be some miso paste. Okay, I'm going to use some white miso, which is the most mild. And no, it's not called white because of the color. That actually has to do with the composition and how it's made. And then I also like to use a little bit of red miso, which is much more intense in flavor and much richer. And I really like the combination of the two. And then besides the miso, one optional ingredient would be to add some finely shredded seaweed of some sort. And I'm using one called hijiki, which you do have to soak first before using, but it has a beautiful nutty, sweet, mushroomy flavor. So that's what I like to use, but wakame would also be a beautiful choice. And then besides that, I think we also want some freshly sliced green onions, as well as some silken tofu, which of course is the softest and most delicate of all the tofus, or at least the ones we get to eat. And to prep this, I like to cut it into like half-inch cubes, which is done by splitting this in half lengthwise. And no, that was not perfectly even, but that's fine. And then once halved, I'm going to cut it in 4 strips this way. And yes, I should probably be cutting all the way to the edge, but I didn't. But that's fine too. And then once we've halved and stripped, we will simply slice across into perfectly even, hopefully half-inch size cubes. And were those all in fact perfectly uniform? No, they were not. But yes, that's fine. We're making soup, just relax. And that's it. Once that stuff's prepped, we can head back to the stove, and we can place the heat on our dashi on medium-high, and if we're using it, we can add our shredded seaweed, which again has been soaked in cold water until soft. And we'll also at this time add a very small splash of soy sauce. Okay, not much, that was only half a teaspoon. And then we can also toss in our green onions. And what we'll do is give all that a stir, and we will wait for this to come back to a simmer. And as soon as it does, and this is critical, we have to reduce our heat to low before we add our miso. So that's exactly what I did. And then speaking of adding the miso, what we want to do is transfer our miso into a small strainer like this, and then we will carefully lower that in while stirring our miso. And that is a very easy, foolproof way to mix that miso in, since if you just dump that paste in and try to stir it together, it doesn't work out too well. Okay, it has a very sticky, grainy texture that loves to clump up, and you're just asking for a lot of unnecessary work and effort. But by stirring it in a strainer like this, it will all eventually pass through, or virtually all of it will. But that's fine. When I get down to those last couple bits, I just dump them in, and I haven't had any complaints yet. And that's it. Once our miso's been stirred in, we will finish our list of things to do by slowly and carefully adding our tofu. And we'll give that a very gentle stir. And as soon as our tofu is heated through, which is only going to take a minute or two, we can go ahead and grab a ladle because our miso soup is done. And we could just go ahead and serve it up, but it's never a bad idea to give it a final taste, just in case you maybe want another touch of soy, or possibly a pinch of salt, or a shake of cayenne, none of which, by the way, I decided I needed. So I went ahead and served up. Oh, by the way, this recipe makes 4 portions, although I'm actually going to serve up a double portion because I'm pretty hungry. The only problem is if you fill this too much, we are not going to be able to see that beautiful tofu. And even though I finished off the top with some more sliced green onions, this did not make for the most stunning pictures I've ever taken. And by the way, as this sits, it's going to fairly quickly separate, with that clear liquid staying on top, and all those fine particles of miso forming sort of a cloud-like appearance underneath, which is what makes the appearance of this soup so interesting and so unique, and I would say beautiful. But when we grab a spoon and go in for a taste, make sure you give it a good and proper stirring. And that, my friends, is one of the world's great soup experiences. Although, like I said, it's almost more of a tea because of the way we steep that kombu in bonito flakes. But anyway, nobody wants tea for lunch, so we're calling it a soup. And what a fantastic soup it is. Okay, as long as you don't let your soup boil or cook too long once you add the miso and tofu, you're going to be enjoying something that, while very simple, is very, very complex flavor-wise, which apparently is what we're going to lose if we do boil the soup. So you know what? Do not boil the soup. And if you are a fan and frequent visitor to Japanese restaurants, you already probably know how amazing this stuff is. And if you don't, what the heck have you been ordering? So yes, enjoying this is always one of my favorite parts of going to a Japanese restaurant. But we probably aren't able to do that as often as we'd like. But happily, as I've hopefully demonstrated here, making your own miso soup at home is very simple and easy, and relatively fast. And I think with just a little bit of practice, you're going to be able to produce something almost as good, if not as good. And by the way, this is about the most basic, straightforward version of miso soup there is. But once you get this down, there are so many different things you can add to this, most of which are very obvious and fairly easy to guess. But if you're not a good guesser, just do a search, and you'll see that the variations are almost endless. But whether you make this as shown, or you decide to add a few other things in, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.